Dark Side of the Moon, In Rainbows, Inner Visions, I Hardly Know Her Visions, Pet Sounds, Low, The White Album, The Black Album, Blue, Kind of Blue, A Kind of Magic, The Venga Boys Party Album. All classics, all of them works of art, not just collections of songs, indeed, not just collections of brilliant songs, but albums. As disparate in genre and style as they are, those albums and many more are all united by the fact that they work cohesively and holistically in a way that makes them more than just the sum of their parts. It's not just about each song taken one by one, but about all of it together. And importantly, these sorts of albums represent the pinnacle, so the story goes, of popular music. But I'm here to tell you that albums are not actually the be-all, end-all of it. They're actually not that big of a deal. They're just one version of a type of composition, the long-form composition, that has existed for ages. Arguably, they're not even the best type of long-form composition, and they're certainly not something that we need to hold sacrosanct for all eternity. We act like the album is the absolute tippy top of all popular music, a sort of sacred format, but it's actually no more than a temporary solution to a set of technological limitations and commercial necessities. A solution that worked for a while, granted, but maybe doesn't work anymore. I want to be clear though, I'm not saying that albums are bad, or that the albums you like don't work, unless of course you like an album that I don't personally like, in which case you suck. No, I'm making a broader point, that thinking albums first as if that's the natural form that pop, rock and jazz and folk and reggae and all that ought to take now and for all time is actively detrimental to how we listen to music, whether old or new, and is harmful to the continuing development of music as an art form. Sure, with the advent of albums, we did get something genuinely new and revolutionary in music, but that doesn't mean we're obliged to keep making music the same way. You see, serious, or at least quite often self-proclaimed serious music fans have been too fully indoctrinated into the insidious and all-consuming cult of the album. This is a cult that demands artists and listeners alike think albums first. Honestly, it's so pervasive that we don't even realize how deeply brainwashed we are. The presumption of albums' preeminence runs through almost every so-called serious discussion of popular music, whether it's some anonymous nerds arguing on Reddit or Twitter or 4chan or whatever, or writers for Rolling Stone magazine, or even people like Rick Beato and Tony Fantano. But it is time to leave the cult. It is time to escape and to deprogram ourselves, okay? Now that we live in an era where albums, or the normative standard of albums, if we're going to be super accurate, make less and less sense each passing year, it's time to look to new ways of creating and listening to popular music. So my point in this video is that music is much, much more than just albums, and albums are so much less than what we like about music. This is the story of how the album came about as a product, the problems that the album solved, the limitations it worked within, and the problems that it has created for us today. It's a story, ultimately, about how musicians always have and always will be interested in writing both short form and long form content, and how the album is just one version of that. Comes in bells, your servant don't forsake. Can we get much higher? So high. Firstly then, let's start in the obvious place. What is an album? An album is, very simply, just a collection of tracks, songs or compositions. Whether we're talking about Prince's Sign of the Times or Adele's Greatest Hits, or even, now that's what I call music number 120. They still make these? Jesus Christ. Honestly, even if it's just your own personal mixtape or Spotify playlist, these are all essentially still albums. They're still just variations on the same things, collections of recordings. It's not really hard, is it? Now, the exact physical reality of the album has changed over the decades, granted. So albums were once stored on a big old flat bit of vinyl like this bad boy.
For just one time,
And along the way we had CDs, tapes, and mini discs too. Today they're mostly just a series of ones and zeros streamed to your ears directly from the internet. But for all that range of forms they physically or digitally take, it all boils down to what I've said already. A music album is just a collection of tracks. No different really to how a photo album is a collection of photos. And in a way, that is all there is to it. But at the same time, there is clearly a lot more to it than this. There is something more to albums beyond just the simple fact of the matter. There always is when it comes to anything, right? If there weren't, then people wouldn't be so committed to the album as a format, and there'd be no cult of the album. As always, the straightforward, simple, boring facts of the matter, i.e. what an album is, are made more complicated by a big, scary thing we call context. It's history, yeah? The album's history is what made it what it is today. So, once upon a time, the only music you would ever hear is what was played directly live in front of you, which is wild to think about today, isn't it? I mean, that was it. You'd hear Grimwald, the village minstrel, strumming away on his lute, and maybe some old shepherd in the local inn singing about doing unspeakable things to sheep. Some things never change, I guess. Skip forwards a bit and we have the absolute most rudimentary beginnings of automatic playback, which is, after all, what an album is. Things like musical boxes. And then even later on, closer to the current day, we have piano rolls. You give these a little bit of instructions in the form of a mechanism and the instrument plays the music for you. That's amazing, but neither of those are albums, are they? We're a long way from the unified, holistic pieces of art composed for the form of playback, a long way from albums as long-form content in their own right. You see, musical boxes and piano rolls almost never had music composed uniquely for them. They'd more often than not be playing you a little folk song or a bit of classical, or later on, ragtime or jazz that was already well known. And in fact, that's what made them sellable as a product. People already knew the music. This is important, though it may not seem so at first. You see, kind of unsurprisingly, if you think about it, albums started the same way. Many of the first albums were of already composed classical music. Classical listeners were the main target market for albums right when they were first made. So, with the invention of albums, you no longer had to physically sit in a concert hall to hear long-form, sophisticated classical music in all its glory. Amazing. Revolutionary. It really was. This does mean, though, that the very development and early marketing of the album as a product was hugely influenced by the sorts of long-form compositions that had already existed for a few hundred years at least. This was true even as late as the 1970s when CDs were first developed. They wanted to be able to fit Beethoven's Ninth specifically on one CD, and that's why they chose the size and potential playback length of a CD album, 90 minutes. Which means that, and again, this is a large part of my point, albums are just one version of something that has existed for ages and ages, right? Anyway, so at this point in the history, we have albums, but they're not actually yet the kind of capital A albums that we're really talking about here. The first of these real albums was probably, according to most historians and critics, Frank Sinatra's In the Wee Small Hours from 1955. In the wee small hours of the morning. Containing thematically linked tunes and produced with a conscious effort to include covers from the Great American Songbook that all worked well together, it is sometimes even called the first concept album. But the actual elevation of the album into its own art form began in earnest really in the mid-60s-ish. That's when popular music artists and audiences stopped seeing albums as just a bunch of songs that needed to come packaged together because they made commercial or practical sense to do that. And instead, albums became objects of artistic expression in and of themselves. Sure, songs on this sort of album might stand all on their own merit. Ain't it just like the night? Tricks when you're trying to, but they made most sense in the context of the album they were released on. And I will sing a lullaby. And we know the usual suspects when we're talking about albums that work as albums, right? From Rubber Soul and Pet Sounds to Dark Side of the Moon and London Calling in the 70s. Then later on there's Purple Rain and OK Computer, To Pimp a Butterfly, whatever floats your boat, right? This history is incredibly important to remember. Albums first came about in a specific cultural context, and albums solved a bunch of problems faced by musicians at that time. Already, this should be enough to make you skeptical about the idea that any format is perfect, timeless, sacrosanct, or best. Albums are only around 60 years old now, and we know that great music is much, much older than that. The substantive point in all of this, well, there's two substantive points in all of this, and I think I've already made a strong case for all this, but I'll lay it out for you. So firstly, albums are above all a product that arose in specific cultural circumstances and made to technological and commercial limitations particular to that moment in history. Pop and rock musicians' primary medium is short-form content, songs mainly for radio play or casual listening, let's be honest. This is how they write music, and that's how they learned how to write music. It's also just the commercial reality of what sells. People mostly like shorter songs, but because a lot of these musicians increasingly wanted to make larger scale artistic statements starting in the 60s, a bunch of them started writing songs as part of albums. The concept album is, of course, the peak of this movement, right? So a bunch of songs, not just written independently, but to work together to tell a story or to make a point. This then became the norm, and ultimately we're still working and operating under that model now. My second big point is that the album is not the thing itself that we should value at all. Long-form content is the valuable thing. Albums in popular music are short-form content organized into long-form content. But we don't need albums for that. We actually don't. It might seem obvious with me saying that now, but well, it is actually all quite obvious. But because our mental model for this is albums, that's just what we're stuck with, and that's what everyone is working to. And look, there are clearly anxieties around the decline of the album and these changing listening habits and what all that means for long-form content in popular music in the age of brain-rotting social media and all that. There are valid concerns, okay? And there's certainly lots worth protecting here. Albums do or did something that we should want from our music. But the issue here is that our expectations and our standards for what long-form content should be are today vestigial. Useful or maybe necessary once upon a time, but not so much now. These expectations are based on an old model that need no longer be considered optimal or even valid. We're so stuck on albums, singles, and EPs that those are almost exclusively the words that we use, given that this is how popular music is almost invariably composed and released. I get that that makes sense, but let's just zoom out a bit and consider the fact that it would be more accurate to talk in terms of long and short form content. We want short form content and we want long form content. Sometimes that means short form content arranged into long form content. That's it. But we don't need albums for that. Anyway, now it's time for my appeal to authority. Rick Wakeman, the keyboard wizard of prog and verified grumpy old man, once said in an interview about the controversial and arguably just very silly Yes album, Tales from Topographic Oceans, that the album includes some very nice musical moments, but because of the format of how records used to be, we had too much for a single album, but not enough for a double. So we padded it out, and the padding is awful. So firstly, I just love how this guy shits on his own artistic creations sometimes. I personally do enjoy Tales from Topographic Oceans, but yeah, it does have some rough patches. Anyway, this quote kind of goes right to the heart of what I'm talking about. He's here saying that the limitations and expectations of the album in an abstract to a very large degree influenced how that specific album turned out. It wasn't a purely artistic thing, removed from practical considerations. It's not that the members of Yes all agreed that this was the right way to write this album. They had a certain amount of material, and the technology of the time put some limitations on them, and so they fit the materials around that. They could have cut some of that material, which may have been the better option, but because the commercial reality of the 70s British prog scene was unusually forgiving, maybe, this allowed them to just go balls deep into writing 4 side-long pieces, each around 20 minutes long. And they still managed to achieve some real commercial success with this album. It sold really well. I mean, I love the 70s. So my point is that something like this is true for every album ever made. Never before has a rock band been afforded such artistic freedom while still being rewarded for it. And still, those same technological and commercial limitations were there, unavoidable and very, very real. They were inescapable. But now, those limitations they're sort of not there anymore, but the cult has trapped us in them anyway. Is that not a bit weird? Anyway, look, I'm not sure if this is going to convince anyone. I'm not even sure if that's what I'm trying to do, to be honest. I guess I just ask people to apply a bit of skepticism to their own expectations of music. Albums are great. The album era, which we're still kind of in, but it is fading, produced lots of fantastic music. But fantastic music existed long before. Remember Grunwald, the village bard from earlier? He wrote some bangers, and fantastic music will still be made if the album dies off. No more albums would not mean no more serious music or no more long-form content in popular music. It would just mean no more albums. Nothing lasts forever. And hey, a postscript that I'm sure no one will watch. I just have so much to say. So I'm just going to say that it's always worth thinking about topics like this alongside other artistic mediums, say film or TV or literature. And the whole long form versus short form tension is as important in those forms as it is in music. The novel may feel today like some form of eternal form of literature, right? But novels also arose in specific circumstances and were a response to the immediate situation authors of that time found themselves in. Loads of now classic novels were actually released in serial form in monthly magazines. Charles Dickens, Henry James, Alexander Dumas, Dostoevsky and Herman Melville all published at least some of their classic works originally in this serialized form. Can you imagine the next classic 21st century novel being released a little bit at a time in The Economist or The Financial Times? It seems crazy. That's basically what happened back then. And there are loads of reasons for why that happened. Like the album, that story would just boil down to a bunch of commercial and technological or practical limitations. So, some of those forms that arose out of necessity, and admittedly, some ambition and artistry, ended up becoming normative standards. Expectations are set that that is how things are done, and so we keep doing them that way. Other times, a form or a medium will be relevant for a while and just die off. But there's nothing inherently more or less artistically serious or proper about one compared to the other. But look, at the end of the day, I get that there's very little point in me idly saying, hey, musicians don't actually need to write albums and we listeners don't need to expect them to do that. There are so many options. That by itself is a little bit worthless. So here's my kind of preemptive response to that, if you were thinking that. Firstly, I would actually accept and agree that a limitation on creativity, which is actually what an album is at the end of the day, these limitations often encourage creativity and can certainly provide some important structure. What makes popular music so great is that it is a product and that the best songwriters and performers in pop understand that they have to do their job in a commercially viable way. So it's not just that musicians compose totally free and formless forms of music without any limitations. They never have. And the structures afforded by ideas like, 3-minute pop song, verse, chorus structure, and yes, even album, these structures actually help write music rather than hinder. Secondly, I'll even tentatively suggest an alternative vision of how musicians could compose and release popular music if we were to move past albums. So how about a sort of serialized conceptual composition, not too unlike those 19th century serialized novels. After all, this form was good enough for those smarty pants, why shouldn't it be good enough for a lowly rock band? Heck, it's good enough for a TV series like Breaking Bad or The Sopranos. And that's all serious art, right? And importantly, still very, very popular and accessible. So a band could release a song or two or even a few at a time, telling part of a bigger story or as part of a bigger idea, piece by piece. They could do it on a set schedule or a bit haphazardly. There are no real barriers to this thanks to the internet, Spotify, YouTube and all that. And to be pragmatic about it, this could give them time to think things through, compose music and lyrics on a more drawn out schedule, as well as respond to audience reactions. Thing is, in saying all this, I know it sounds goofy, it feels for some reason tacky, and certainly very un-rock and roll. And that's a large part of the barrier to changing models and for changing the normative standards around this stuff. It'd be a commercial and artistic risk. How would audiences react to it? How would critics react? Is it a viable model? Are people too stuck on the album model to accept it? Who knows? And that's just how it feels artistically. My point here is that it is just as much about commerciality as it is about art, even if we'd like to think otherwise. Even if something like a serialized composition in popular music might sound like a great, fun, or interesting idea, the reality is that the entire music industry is still built around albums, EPs, and single releases, with advertising, radio plays, promotional material, merchandise, and hype building all oriented around the idea that pop and rock musicians produce albums. An artist going their own way about it all might work really well. It could be revolutionary, but it could be a complete failure. And so no one is going to do it, at least not until they believe that they can make money doing it, while also satisfying that creative itch all good artists feel. Anyway, see you around. Hopefully you found this interesting or thought-provoking or something like that.